This is your World War III update. The North Koreans have just fired missiles into the Yellow Sea. This is being viewed as a very significant provocation by the South Koreans, who've now put their military on the highest state of alert. The Korean Peninsula is on a razor's edge of full-blown war, along, of course, with their American nuclear submarine-wielding counterparts. If you go down south a little bit, you'll find that the Chinese, over the last 24 hours, have floated 6 stratospheric balloons over the island of Taiwan. Now, this is significant. Many of you are familiar with these balloons. Of course, 1 year ago today, there was Balloon Gate that happened over North America. These stratospheric balloons can be used as delivery platforms for numerous weapon systems. Primarily, their function is for ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, but they can be used to deploy electromagnetic pulse weapons. You can fire missiles from them, you can drop bombs from them, you can do electronic warfare, GPS jamming. This might signal that China is indeed getting ready for, in the very least, some kind of embargo in order to put pressure on Taiwan in the run-up to the U.S. election. Now, a variety of things in multiple theaters are all going to coincide. We have a major Russian offensive that's about to take place in the next few months. We have the biggest NATO exercise happening in the next few months, already started, in fact. We have veritable escalation across the Middle East as we speak. All of these things could potentially coincide, and I'm not saying that there's high-level coordination between the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, and their militia groups, as well as the Russians, but this would be the time to coordinate if you were them, because this is when we are going to be at our weakest in the run-up to election season. Now, moving to the Middle East, we have the IRGC leader, the Iranian-backed militia leader, Abu Ala al-Wala, calling for the Islamic resistance, including Iran, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, to intensify the conflict and move to the next phase of operations. This is the terminology that they use, the next phase of operations. This, of course, would signal that they've been coordinating their attacks and their maneuvers up until this point. Now, some people might say, well, duh. However, there is no evidence to demonstrate that there is high-level coordination between Yemen, Iran, Iraq, and all of these actors. It may be such that they are staggering their attacks, trying to get the United States into a game of whack-a-mole that it cannot win. All of this, of course, in response to massive airstrikes, not only on Yemen, but in Iraq. The White House can say there's not a war going on there, but you can bet your ass there's a war going on there. And Lebanon certainly believes so, because they were doing mass casualty drills today, simulating Israeli strikes on one of their biggest hospitals in Beirut. Of course, the Israelis were doing the same just last week in their hospitals that are nearest the northern border, where most people have currently been evacuated in the hundreds of thousands. The Houthis have also ordered all U.S. and British citizens working for the UN to leave Yemen immediately. I suspect that they are concerned about intelligence leaks. I suspect that they think perhaps the United States has been as successful as they say in some of these strikes, although I highly doubt it because it's subterranean for the most part, and good luck getting, even with a bunker buster, into these 20-meter deep bunkers. It's just impossible. So it's very likely that this is about intelligence, some kind of mole in the UN that is leaking intel to the Americans and their coalitional forces. The Israelis had one of their air control centers at Meron Airport bombed by Hezbollah. This is significant because typically when you're going to go to war with a country, the first thing you try to take out, or the first thing you probe, is the airports. Now, according to numerous experts and military analysts, as well as the Israeli government themselves, they think that if a deal cannot be reached before the end of the month, then a war with Hezbollah is most certainly imminent. And it appears as though they've had to make some concessions in Gaza because they can't appear to destroy this vast network of Hamas tunnels. The IDF has admitted officials at all levels, including generals, say that destroying the tunnel network is impossible. Remember a couple weeks ago when they were talking about just flooding the tunnels? That's all you had to do is just flood them with seawater. Well, apparently that ain't working out too well, because in addition to not being able to take out the tunnel networks, they also lost 21 soldiers in a mass casualty event. According to some reports, this was a booby trap building, booby trapped by Hamas in conjunction with an actual offensive staged by Hamas. At the same time, they lost 21 soldiers and probably countless amounts of injuries, casualties as well. Going back to the point about subterranean warfare, we are coming to find, whether it's in Bakhmut, Mariupol, or the Gaza Strip, we can extrapolate that it's virtually impossible to win a modern conventional war when it goes underground. I mean, we should have known that from the time of Vietnam, but what more evidence do we need? And if subterranean warfare makes conventional war unwinnable, then the only way you can win a war is via unconventional tactics. And when we've exhausted all of our soft tactics, that only leaves one other option, and that is the nuclear option. So this is what I'm concerned about most. We're going to talk about the bullshit doomsday clock assessment that was issued by the failed actuarial scientists over at the Bulletin for Atomic Scientists today, and why their assessment is complete and utter garbage and likely some form of damage control, possibly ado with the election that looms. Sweden has had their accession to NATO finally ratified by the Turks. This is surprising, although not going to be that surprising to the Russians, who are already prepared for this eventuality. They knew that this pernicious creep of NATO towards their borders was going to continue until NATO was fully at their borders, which they are right now. Sweden has already started doing joint maneuvers with NATO forces in advance of even being inside NATO. So this is really a nothing burger. It's a formality, but it definitely signifies that there's only one more country left to bring into NATO, and that's whatever remains of Ukraine. They will be the good old 33rd country in NATO. Russia is now deploying S-300 missiles inside St. Petersburg. This is very significant because, of course, St. Petersburg is 1,000 kilometers from Ukraine. I know we don't care anymore that Russia is being bombed on a daily basis by Ukrainian drones, or at least so they say. We still don't know if these drones are coming from the Baltic Sea, possibly the Baltic states, although I highly doubt it, because that would be a full-blown declaration of war, and you can bet that the Russians won't hesitate to drop some bombs on Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, because they know that NATO does not have the conventional forces to fight them, much less, I mean, we're just talking about fight them in the trenches, never mind a subterranean conflict. If you can't beat little old Hamas and its few hundred kilometers of tunnels, you really think you're going to go on against the subterranean metropoles, these labyrinthine networks underneath China, underneath Russia, underneath Lebanon even, where there's hundreds of miles more tunnels, in Yemen? You're just not going to do it. It's impossible. Get the biggest bunker busters you want. Probably with nuclear weapons, you can't even touch a lot of these places, and you most certainly are not going to see a total victory. So this is what we have to look forward to, guys. Belarus is preparing for war with NATO. Lukashenko met with his generals today. Recall that just 48 hours ago, they altered their nuclear doctrine to allow, perhaps afford them, loosen the requirements necessary for them to utilize. Now they say if attacked by any nation, they will reserve the right, whether they're attacked with conventional or nuclear means, they will utilize nuclear weapons. This is a clear message to NATO, who is currently masquerading on their border with potentially 90,000 troops over the next couple months under the guise of Operation or Exercise Steadfast Defender, which some people are suggesting is a way to get NATO close to the Suwalki corridor, which of course is the pathway that bridges Belarus with Russia's exclave Kaliningrad. Russia utilizes this exclave not only in the event of a nuclear war to launch a whole lot of missiles, also it's a warm water port. It is a place where they can conduct GPS jamming and electronic warfare with NATO. So the S-300s in St. Petersburg is very significant because it signifies that not only are the Russians concerned that perhaps war with Finland is coming, and that's the other thing we have to take into consideration here, is that the S-300s are not only for Ukraine, they might be genuinely concerned that these probing operations, as I've long since suspected, are just an intelligence gathering operation. These drone strikes and possibly the entirety of the Ukraine war is just NATO exploiting the conflict in order to gather intelligence for the inevitable war with Russia that everybody says is coming. In fact, yet another country today openly talked about that. Norway, the head of the General Staff of Norway, called on their citizenry and their military primarily, to prepare for possible war with Russia. We are seeing these conflicts, or these announcements, be staggered from week to week. Every other day now, we're hearing some other European leaders say, we gotta prepare to go to war with the Russians. Now, Jan Stoltenberg, the chief of NATO, came out today and said, oh yeah, we're not worried about war with Russia because they have to do a bit of damage control because people are actually starting to panic. Now, the best intelligence also suggests that Russia is going to do a major offensive this summer. So you're going to have all of these things coinciding at the same time. That might lead some to suspect that there is some high-level coordination between the Chinese, who are currently running these sorties over Taiwan, getting close to the airspace, putting stratospheric balloons up in the air, this saber-rattling with the North Koreans, the IRGC coming out and calling on their militia groups for a escalation and entering the next phase of whatever their operation is. We could very well see all of these intensities of conflict coincide at the same time at some point this year. And of course, they might want to do it in the run-up to the election, depending on what the election is. Now, depending on which side you might agree with, there are rumors to suggest that both sides might try some provocation. There is rumors that the Ukrainian intelligence chief, Budanov, may actually replace the current commander of the Ukrainian military, Zaluzhny, for some reason. Perhaps he's just not mentally fit up to the task, or perhaps they're wanting a change, or perhaps only Budanov is willing to do what they want him to do in order to trigger some sort of NATO involvement in the conflict. Recall that Russia, for the first time in some time, remined the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Do they know, or do they suspect, that the Ukrainians are going to stage some sort of false flag attack? Remember, about a year and a half ago now, boy, time flies, Sergei Shoigu had an emergency call with all of the defense ministers of the NATO countries, warning them that they knew that Ukraine was planning some sort of dirty bomb attack, and you wouldn't get Sergei Shoigu contacting all of the top brass of their adversarial countries if there wasn't, some fire to that smoke. So it might not have been exactly how they stated it, but something was definitely brewing. Is that something about to happen again? Because if Ukraine is genuinely concerned that Trump is not going to get them the funding that they need to further this war, and that the war hawks are going to choose the Middle East war instead, then they might be inclined to do something incredibly stupid, okay? Speaking of nuclear weapons, Russia is training their soldiers for nuke explosions utilizing a ground nuclear explosion simulator. When I bust out the camera today, I needed a break from the screens, guys. When I bust that out tomorrow, I'll actually show you a bit more about that program. We'll go into a bit more depth. And according to an article by the experts at the Daily Mail, I've been saying this for some time, They are concerned that Russia will not be afraid to use nuclear weapons in a war with NATO because it believes that the U.S. will not sacrifice its 300 million and growing, if the border is any metric, population. They will not sacrifice them for little old Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania. No offense to them, but let's get real here. This NATO Article 5 thing, it's not written in stone, and there is also no hard and fast rule in terms of what support the NATO coalition has to offer when one of their members is attacked. Is it conventional? Is it just financial? Do they support them, but does it not go nuclear? But is there a risk that it goes nuclear? Because immediately when you invoke Article 4 or 5, automatically the Russians put their nuclear forces on a hair trigger. That's when the dead hand is like a ticking time bomb. If you don't know what that is, that's a system that they put into place. In such case, if there was the decapitation strike, the Russians could still launch all of their nuclear missiles. Okay, now let's talk quickly about this doomsday clock nuttery. The Bulletin for Atomic Scientists, the self-proclaimed apocalyptic actuarial scientists, claim that they didn't want to move the clock forward at all. It was 90 seconds to midnight last year, and yes, I know this is strictly ordinal, completely subjective, arbitrary data or a designation, but still, they're trying to do a bit of damage control here, I do believe, because last year it was 90 seconds to midnight. This year, it hasn't changed at all, which leads me to believe that they must presume that the existential risks present over the past year were no more significant than last January of 2023. Well, here's why I beg to differ. This is what has happened, and this is just a fraction of the things that would have most definitely contributed to any sane increase in the doomsday clock. The suspension of the nuclear test ban treaty that happened in the past year. Yes, the United States was never a signatory to it in the first place, but it was still one of those informalities that is no more. That in and of itself, being the Bulletin for Atomic Scientists, you think that would move the clock at least a few seconds. After all, these guys moved the clock 30 seconds from 2017 to 2018, when really not a whole lot happened. Clearly, that was a political move at the time. It was probably related to Trump. Let's face it, okay? And you guys know me, I'm a moderate. I'm not even really a Trump guy, to be brutally honest. But at this time, I mean, throw a wild card in the fire and see what happens, I guess. But the ship is sinking. It doesn't matter who you put up there. It's going down in flames. It's just, who do you want to be entertained by? Do you want to be entertained by the guy who's willing to do, 3-hour-long press conferences off the cuff and say some pretty funny things every once in a while? Or do you just want to laugh at the guy who can't remember where he is half the time? It's up to you. It doesn't matter. The ship is sinking, man, all right? Nuclear weapons installed in Belarus. Belarus just changed their nuclear doctrine. Okay, those two things alone should have at least bumped it up a few seconds. But why not? Probably because there's still some boxes they got to check, still some agenda that they got to push, and they got to keep the people pacified for the time being. The suspension of the Conventional Forces Treaty in Europe, Germany committing 5,000 troops into the Baltic states. I mean, these are all big things. You have the literal iron curtain separating the East and West again, and it didn't even move it a needle? Are you kidding me? The biggest exercises in NATO's history, closures of the border in Russia. Now you have the Baltic states talking about mining the borders, building bunkers along the borders. Finland's border is essentially closed permanently with Russia. You have, of course, Finland entering into NATO in the past year. North Korean nuclear proliferation has been off the charts. Just claimed that they did a nuclear test, a nuclear weapons test a couple days ago. All sorts of suspicious activity at their nuclear testing sites. You have China, Russia, and the USA all committing to proliferation in terms of upgrading their nuclear arsenal. The United States is now saying they need to reach parity not only with the not only with the Russians, but also with the Chinese. So that means if the Chinese get 2,000 nukes and the Russians have 6,000 nukes, we need to get 8,000 nukes. Well, what does that mean? That means the Chinese need to do the same and the Russians need to do the same. And we've had it confirmed by satellite data that all of the aforementioned countries are currently busy doing stuff at their nuclear weapon testing sites. In fact, the United States did a non-nuclear nuclear weapons test earlier last year. And how this doesn't move the needle, I simply don't know. These people are clearly on the take. You have the biggest nuclear exercises, full-on nuclear drills, never before seen. Russia conducting last year. We have the largest emergency alert tests in history, one in the United States. I think there was another one in the UK. We have, of course, October 7th happen. We have threats of the Samson option, attacks on Israel's nuclear facilities, the clear and obvious threat of that entire region descending into conflict. You have the collapse of the Iranian nuclear deal. I mean, in what reality are they keeping the clock the same when all of this shit has happened? You got mounting cybersecurity threats, and then they want to talk about the climate thing. Okay, well, let's talk about that. Warmest year on record, far and away. Okay, we're going to have another guest on. He's going to talk about global dimming, the aerosol masking effect, how the sulfides in the atmosphere actually contain a lot of the heat. And now that those sulfides are going away because of clean energy air initiatives, and this is where we're going to get into some weird stuff. But trust me, you're going to want to get on this one. But we've seen record wildfires, 300% increase in wildfires across the map. Civil unrest, protests, social instability, the stuff going on in Germany. You got disease X risks, Wuhan lab revelations. You got record debt increases, de-dollarization, China-Taiwan tensions. That's just to name a few. And these guys want us to think that, oh, yeah, it's okay. It's like, are they working for Jan Stoltenberg? Because they're saying the exact same thing that he is saying today. And these people have no frickin' clue what's going on. Or they do, and they're just bought and paid for. It's okay, though. According to the New Scientist, seaweed is what's going to save us. Okay, so they have a plan. Seaweed could save 1 billion people from famine after nuclear war. Isn't that great? Seaweed is considered one of the best options for feeding humanity in the event of a catastrophic event like a nuclear war that blocks out the sun. Previous research suggests that nuclear war could lead to the emission of 150 million tons of soot, causing a 9-degree temperature drop. Now, this is just theoretical. We spoke with a nuclear expert before on the topic of nuclear winter, and while it is possible, it is not 100% guaranteed that nuclear winter is going to be a thing that actually happens. But let's just, play into this for a second. Scientists, including Florian Ulrich Gen, modeled how seaweed would fare in such a scenario and found that we could still grow up to 13% per day. Oh, okay. 13% of 100% of seaweed. How are you going to get the seaweed? Within 9 to 14 months, seaweed cultivated on ropes between buoys could potentially provide up to 15%. You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of the movie Snowpiercer. Because in that movie, they feed the poor people crickets, and the elites eat all the meat. They essentially tell you what's going to happen. So instead of bugs, they're going to feed us like seaweed bars, and they're going to make it into meat, and maybe they're going to genetically modify it so it even tastes like meat. If you're good, if you do everything Big Brother asks of you that month, maybe you'll get the meat tasting variant. Seaweed is a top candidate for a quick upscaling of food production in the face of a disrupted food system. Is this really what they're considering here? This is crazy. I had to pay for this article. This shit was behind a paywall. The things I do for you guys. The tropics and some subtropical regions would still support the growth of land crops and seaweed due to nutrient-rich deep waters rising in a nuclear winter scenario. I mean, it's interesting. It's good to know that I guess you could survive off seaweed if the shit hit the fan. but I'm certain that there's going to be some salination issues there. Anyways, guys, all I can say, keep on prepping. We have one little point of good news today, I should say, and that was that a Supreme Court in Canada ruled that Trudeau's invocation of the Emergencies Act, which gave him sweeping powers during the truckers' protest, was deemed to be unreasonable and unconstitutional. So it's almost like they're starting to throw the left under the bus. Maybe they're starting to pivot. Maybe the deep state, or the crown in our case, that's our deep state. It's the crown, it's the queen. People will say, that's not true. Yes, it is. They're on the money, damn it. Some people will say, that's not true. But I think, anyways, let's not go there. I guess it's a small win. We'll see what shape it takes. Either way, the problem here in Canada is you have the NDP, the Greens, and the Bloc Québécois, the Liberals, of course, who will just form a coalition if they don't win and the Conservatives win. And so, and I'm not even like a big conservative. Like I'm like driving on a road. Some days, if you got a bit of a shimmy, you gotta go to the left. Other days, you gotta go to the right. That's where I am. I'm not a diehard anything. I'm a living, breathing, dead Republican. I'm not one of these people. Some days you're gonna have to veer right. Some days you're gonna have to veer left, because if you go too far in one direction, things get way too extreme and people start to lose their marbles a little bit. And that's when I retreat to the bunker. So keep on prepping, my friends, and check out the video I just released a few hours ago, I think. It's all about preparedness food, and we test some food that's 20 years old. People keep saying, why don't you release, the old prepping videos? The thing is, we do, guys, and unfortunately, we are not in the good books of the algorithm, and I'm not one to complain about the algorithm, but it's become abundantly clear that at least in terms of search and even suggested videos to a large extent, this channel is, I don't want to say shadow banned, because I don't want to get into some self-fulfilling prophecy, woe is me, opining on how bad my life is when it's great by and large. But indeed, if you go and you search the Canadian Prepper YouTube channel, only 2 videos will come up at the top of the page, and the rest of the videos will be completely other unrelated stuff. And if you do that with any other major channel, that doesn't happen. Even the ones who produce far more risque content than I. Now, what that tells me is that maybe we're doing something right. And what that also tells me is that they're afraid of whatever it is we are saying. And this is the scary thing, is I'm not promoting a political message. I've made that abundantly clear in this video. But they're trying to keep us in a state of arrested development. There's a glass ceiling that we can't seem to transcend, that somebody doesn't want us to transcend, because they know we'll get mass appeal, okay? And quite frankly, maybe that's a blessing in disguise, because I ain't the kind of guy who's going to kiss the ring or who's going to take a knee, and I think they know that. That's all I got for you today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to share, like, and comment. It helps the channel out. Canadian Prepper out.